Hey there guys, what I wanted to do with this is just kind of give you a review of the Civil War that happened, because since we're starting in chapter 16, we're talking about Reconstruction, so I just want to go back and give a review of what was covered in chapter 15. If you took 1301 last semester, then you're very familiar with the Civil War. If not, hopefully this will just serve as kind of a supplement to kind of put you into frame of what's happening in chapter 16. So this is just a quick review of the American Civil War. It was fought 1861 to 1865. So I want to give you a timeline of secession. And as you know, secession means those states that seceded from the Union or left the Union. So the first thing that happened is in November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln becomes the president-elect. So he's nominated as the president. He's going to take over the presidency in 1861. But when he becomes the president-elect, it's not too long after that that South Carolina decides to leave the Union. And in December of 1860, they meet and decide that they are going to withdraw from the Union. January through February of 1861, you've got 6 more states that leave. You've got Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas get together and decide to secede from the Union. That happens January into February. Also in February, you have delegates from all those states except for Texas. They meet and they create the Confederate States of America, and they elect Jefferson Davis as their president. And then in April of 1861, you have the battle at Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter it's part of South Carolina. It was still in Union control, and Lincoln is sending reinforcements and supplies to Fort Sumter because they can't get out of it to resupply their food and everything, because South Carolina, as you know, is now taken over by Confederacy. But this fort is still under Union control, and so Lincoln still has control of that fort, so that's why he's trying to send reinforcements down there, and that's where the first shots are fired. So that really jump starts the Civil War. After Fort Sumter, you've got some more states that leave the Union. April, that same month, April 17th of that month, 5 days after the Battle of Fort Sumter, Virginia leaves the Union. And then in May of 1861, the beginning of May, Arkansas leaves, and then at the end of May, North Carolina leaves. And then June 8th of 1861 is when Tennessee leaves the Union. So those are the 11 states that are going to make up the Confederate States. This is just a picture of Fort Sumter and the battle that was ensuing there. Kind of an interesting fact about Fort Sumter, though, is that it's actually an island. It's just in the middle of this harbor or bay. It sits out there all by itself. So this is what it looks like today. Very small little area. It's not right there in South Carolina, you know, it's right outside in the harbor. So some northern advantages that they had during the Civil War: one, they had a lot more people living in the north, a lot more that would be able to fight. You have to remember, most of the population in the south, it's going to be African American slaves that are in the south. So they do have a larger white population. Even African Americans are going to be in the north, and eventually they're going to be fighting. They have larger industrialization and manufacturing pool, so they can supply their own ammunition, supply their own clothing. All of the textile factories, all that is in the north. There's not a whole lot of that in the south. The railroad system is more connected. Every state in the north is connected by railroads. Usually more than one railroad line is running through that state. They have a very strong navy, and they also have control of the merchant marine. The southern advantages: this is going to be a war that's fought at home. They're just going to have to defend what they already have. The less cost in men and less cost in materials because of that defensive war. They also have, their leadership is a little bit different. Lincoln had never really held a political office before, and it was a very short term that he held office. Political leadership, you've got a lot of congressmen, senators that have been serving in the political atmosphere for a long time. You also have really strong military leadership. These are men that have fought before. They fought in the Battle of New Orleans, they fought in the Mexican-American War, and so you've got some great military leadership in the South that the North just doesn't have. Some major battles that took place during the Civil War: Fort Sumter, like we just talked about. The Civil War is going to commence after that. And then you have the first Battle of Bull Run. It's a Confederate victory and it raises Confederate hopes. You've got the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. This is going to be a tactical Union victory. There are 23,000 casualties. That kind of surprises everyone that that many men are going to die at Shiloh. And then you have the Second Battle of Bull Run. This is another Confederate victory, and this is, not too long. It's about a year after the Battle of the First Bull Run. The troops are a lot more organized in this battle. It wasn't as easy as defeat as the first time the Union went up against the Confederacy, but it does help to boost morale in the South. Then in September, a month later, you have Antietam. The Confederates, they're trying to advance northward, and it's going to be halted. So Robert E. Lee and his advance northward is halted. Lincoln has his confidence is regained that maybe the North could win this war, and he announces his plans for emancipation. He announces it in September. It won't go into effect until January, and then even in January, it's very limited effect that it has. We'll talk about that in just a minute. July of 1863, with the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest Civil War battle. It is a Confederate defeat, and Lee is going to retreat at this battle. The next one that we have is at Vicksburg. The Union is going to gain control of the Mississippi River. It's about a 150-mile stretch that they're going to gain control of, and this is going to be so important to the North because they have essentially cut off the supply chain to the South. That's the only river that the South was keeping control of and able to move, northward and southward along this river's supply. And once the Union takes over, it's going to cut off even industrialization and moving livestock and crops to the north. That's going to be cut off by the Union. June of 1864 through April of 1865. You have the Siege of Petersburg, and this is Lee is trying to advance and make his way to the north. Unfortunately, his defenses are exhausted, and in April of 1865, Lee is going to surrender to Grant in Virginia, and this is going to be the Southerners surrendering, kind of admitting defeat at this point. That's going to end the Civil War. Backing up to when Lincoln issued or talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't free all the slaves. It only freed slaves that were living in those states that were in rebellion. So those Confederate states, it freed them there. And as we all know, Confederate troops are not going to go in and free their slaves, so they're still going to be in slavery. It didn't have any impact on the border states. If you were a slave living in those states, you were still under slavery. It had very, very limited impact on slaves. Like I said, the slaves were not freed in the South just because he talked about it and issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. It did have a lot of political importance, though, because it's, essentially saying if the North wins the war, we're going to free the African Americans that are in slavery. By doing that, Lincoln essentially is going to free some of those slaves to help win the war. We have the 1st Black Regiment. It's Massachusetts 54th. There's actually a movie about that. It's got Matthew Broderick. If any of you are familiar with Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the main character is actually General Shaw in that. But it's a really good movie. But it talks about the Massachusetts 54th, and that was the 1st Black Regiment that was organized in Massachusetts. By the end of the war, 1 in 8 Union soldiers are black. Unfortunately, they were all segregated. Most black units were put under the charge of a white person or white commander. They were not integrated, so you don't have, a mixed unit. A lot of times they were making half the pay as their white counterparts. There's going to be a higher casualty rate because Confederate soldiers are not going to take African American or black prisoners of war. They're going to execute them once they are captured. But they do have a lot of military valor. They're fighting for something that, is obviously incredibly important to them. And so their battles and victory and their willingness to volunteer kind kind of outshines the Confederacy. In 1865, when all is said and done and Lee surrenders to Grant, you've got 600,000 dead, both the North and the South. Destruction is laid down in the South. There's nothing really left. Those plantations, houses, crops, livestock, everything is destroyed, burned, killed, butchered. There's bitterness on both sides, but one thing that does come out of that, it is the final death of slavery and the end of secession. When we get into Reconstruction, the 20 years of Reconstruction, it takes a long time for those states to come back in. And, unfortunately, Lincoln is going to be assassinated during the first part of Reconstruction. So it's going to change shape several times. But you do have the ending of slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation after it's issued in January of 1863. It finally takes effect the summer of 1865, about 18 months after it was issued. And if you're from Texas and you know when slavery ended in Texas, it ended in Galveston on June 19th, 1865, and it's a special holiday that we celebrate here in Texas called Juneteenth. And that ended slavery in Texas at that point. So that was just a quick review of what was going on during the Civil War. I know I did not do it justice. I just wanted to do some highlights for you and tell you what all was going on. But feel free to, use this if you need to kind of set up your mind of where we are as far as American history. The next video that you're going to watch is going to cover chapter 16, and that is your reading assignment for week 2.